have some cutting tools we'll show you later on. Marking out, start off the distance from the end of your material accurately measured on the rule from the squared off end, and using a tri-square held firmly across the material, a line is drawn perpendicular at right angles to the edge with a sharp pencil. The width of the joint can be either measured or taken from the specific material that's going to be the second part of the joint. Here we see the width of the material being just marked on the side, but again a tri-square is used to accurately draw a line across the material. For this joint, the lines have to be carried over onto 3 surfaces, 2 edges and 1 face. Here again, grasping firmly the tri-square across the material, the lines are carried across the edge, and from the front edge, again on the opposite side. Lines across the material are easily drawn with a tri-square, but to draw lines parallel to the edge, we need to use a marking gauge. In this case, the marking gauge is set with the rule as shown. The camera doesn't show it particularly clearly. By loosening the thumb screw, you can get a close approximation to the size, and then tighten and adjust finally by tapping one end or the other to the required size, so that the pin on the marking gauge, in this case, marks out 20mm. Extra lock, and then ready to mark out lines parallel to an edge. This can be normally held in a vise, but this demonstration, a spike hole is marked on the far edge of the line, so that when the marking gauge curls along, it drops into that, stopping the mark going any further than the required length. So again, spiking this end point, held firmly against the edge, and run along parallel to the edge. Not the easiest to see, so a pencil line can then be added to highlight accurately. Now this little groove comes in handy later on. Waistwood is marked. It seems a bit obvious as to which bit is getting cut out, but on occasions you'll stop, go back to a job, and just extra double check that the material to be removed is on the inside of those lines. We're now going to use a knife, in this case a Stanley knife, to cut the fibres across the material just on the waist side of the line. So the waist side is being used here again. That's done on both sides. Then using the flat surface of a bevel edge chisel, we create a notch. You see the chisel being pressed in up to the knifed line. The operation is referred to as knifing and notching. Knifing, cutting across the fibres, and notching, as you can see in the slow motion below, cutting a V-shaped notch, fingers held well behind the blade, a downward forward pressure against the bench hook. The little V-shaped groove you can see on the edges is going to be the ideal guide for the tenon saw. Starts with a T. Tenon saw held with index finger forward and the material held firmly against the sawing board, cutting at right angles across, drawing back 3 times, and gradually lowering the blade of the saw till we cut horizontally. It's important we cut vertical cut and no further down than the marks already indicated by the marking gauge. The sawing action itself doesn't take much downward pressure. Again, like on the waist side of the line with the second notch, drawn back 3 times. Somebody stole my pencil. Gradually lowering the blade to horizontal, cutting flat across. We've now got the material cut, the fibres cut to depth, so we're using the vise this time to hold the material. We now have to remove the bulk of the waste material. So it's been marked out, knifed and notched, tenon saw has been used, and now we choose the correct width of bevel edge chisel. The width of the blade should be slightly narrower than the slot to be cut. So in this case, with the forearm held firmly against the bench, the chisel is used with the sloping bevel on the underside. It's either struck by hand or with a mallet. As the chisel progresses into the wood, it rises up towards the centre. So striking action causing the chisel to rise up. You can see in this detail there's a large ridge left in the middle. Turning the material round and carrying out the same operation from the other side. Remember, tools kept in the tool well when they're not in use, and you choose the correct chisel. So again, striking by hand, or more practically for younger students, wooden mallet, gently tapping on the end. You can see from the cutaway the chisel rising towards the middle of the groove. Not quite down to the line yet, but several passes with this bevel edge chisel will take the material down to the depth required, with the marking gauge line cut with a pin forming a little groove as an indicator of how deep the chisel should go. Again, forearm on the desk, on the bench, mallet and chisel, and working just towards the middle, never taking the chisel right the way through the material. Final action is paring, where we take the chisel face flat edge down, and with both hands well behind the blade is a shearing action, pressing towards the middle of the wood again to give a flat base to this housing. Now on occasions the saw cut may not have gone down deep enough, in which case we'd have to clean the edges of this groove. You see here, as the fibres are splitting, they still tend to catch on the side, so a tenon saw is used just to dress off the inside corner, both sides. And a final paring action down using the groove cut by the marking gauge to indicate full depth. Now for a normal through housing, this would be sufficient, and you can see the second part of the material slotting into position here. And without the use of any adhesives, we have a tight fit, a little bit more pressure, and we have the housing finished. In this case, we're going to go on to produce something a little bit more akin to a cross halving joint, but we're going to remove material from the shelf piece as well. So the widths are indicated by the first piece. These are just lengths, not full marks. We then use the same tools as before to mark out first the lines that are perpendicular to the edge of the material, or right angles. In this case, tri-square, squeezing again across the material, sharp pencil on the mark, and across both sides. We then have to indicate where the material is going to be cut in terms of depth. And like last time, we're going to use the marking gauge. In this case, slacken off the block, adjust to the size, again 20mm in this case. Actually, I think it was 17, there we go. Tighten the thumb screw, and then check with adjustments top and bottom to close to the final size. Material would normally be held in the vise for the next part, but for the purposes of this demonstration, the pin is used to create a little hole at the end of the marking gauge line. And it's a little easier to see with the camera, we're sliding the marking gauge along the length of the material. So again, marking gauge for lines parallel to the edge, tri-square for lines perpendicular or right angles. And again, a sharp pencil just helps highlight the line you've marked out. Wastewood marked as before. This information obviously has to exist on 3 surfaces, so carried over with the tri-square, this time material held in the vise. Size is marked over onto this new edge. And again on this side, once we've used the marking gauge, once we use the tri-square, it's the marking gauge to give the depth, and make sure you mark it on the correct side. So again, spike, you can see the hole in position, And as you move this across, you actually feel it notch into the hole at the end of the groove. Again, marked and waste wood indicated. Using a push stick. Then the fence can be adjusted to the required size. In this case, with a man-made board such as MDF, this is sufficient. Set to the waist side of the line, the fence is brought into position, checked, locked in place, and again with the push stick, cut to depth. Within a machine, you make sure it's switched off before you adjust, so the second line is adjusted with the fence. Again to the waist side of the line, again the fence is locked. Additional cuts are made in the middle of the joint just to make it easier to remove with such a long section of waste material. Two methods of removing that now. One would be using the bevel edge chisel, very similar to the last process, in this case using the mallet, and the one we'll show you just in a minute involves using a jigsaw. As always, when you're removing material with a chisel, keep people clear of the downwind side, as some of the material can come off rather fast. So the second method would be using a jigsaw. You can see the original 5 cuts. It's carefully turned on spot. Note that the jigsaw has the foot resting on top of the material. I think we can see fairly clearly, cutting just on the waist side of the material as it goes across, those extra cuts allowing the waste material to fall free.